The corridors of Buckingham Palace were built to preserve control. Every marble arch, every velvet rope, every silent guard standing motionless along the walls existed to ensure that nothing inside those historic halls ever unfolded unexpectedly. For centuries, royal protocol had operated like a perfectly balanced clock, precise, predictable, and unbreakable. But on one quiet evening inside the palace, something happened that none of those traditions were prepared for. In the middle of a formal reception, surrounded by diplomats, senior courtiers, and members of the royal household, a young princess made a gesture so small that most people in the room never noticed it. 2 fingers lifted briefly, then lowered again. To the untrained eye, it looked like nothing, but to the royal guard standing across the corridor, the meaning was unmistakable, because that movement was not a child's innocent gesture. It was a security signal. A signal so rare, so restricted, that only a handful of palace protection officers were ever meant to recognize it. Within seconds, the impossible happened. A royal guard stepped directly into the path of Queen Camilla, halting her movement through the palace corridor. And in that frozen moment of silence, a question began to spread through Buckingham Palace. How could a young princess possibly know a signal that wasn't meant to exist? The corridors of Buckingham Palace had returned their familiar quiet, yet something invisible lingered in the air, the echo of a moment that should never have happened. Only minutes earlier, the ceremonial rhythm of the evening reception had been unfolding with the quiet precision that had defined royal gatherings for generations. Diplomats, courtiers, and members of the royal household had moved through the state apartments beneath towering chandeliers, each step guided by a choreography perfected over centuries. Everything about the evening had been designed to project calm continuity. But that illusion had fractured the moment a single gesture was made. A gesture so small that most of the room had never noticed it. Yet for one royal guard standing along the marble corridor, it had changed everything. The soldier had been posted near the entrance to the gallery hall, standing in full ceremonial uniform. Scarlet tunic pressed without flaw, polished boots aligned precisely against the carpet's edge, the ceremonial rifle resting across his chest in practiced stillness. To those passing by, he appeared almost statue-like, but the discipline of the royal guard was never passive. Every guard assigned to the palace was trained to observe without appearing to observe, to absorb the subtle rhythm of movement within the palace walls while remaining outwardly motionless. The echo of footsteps, the cadence of conversation, the direction of a glance, everything mattered. That evening had seemed entirely routine, until the princess looked at him. Princess Charlotte stood several paces away near one of the tall palace windows, with a fading evening light spilled across the polished floor. She had paused briefly beside her aides as guests passed through the corridor toward the reception rooms. For a child growing up inside Buckingham Palace, scenes like this were not unfamiliar. She had attended receptions before. She had watched the quiet rituals of palace life unfold with the curiosity expected of someone her age. But tonight, something about her attention was different. She wasn't studying the paintings. She wasn't watching the guests. Her eyes had settled on the guard. At first, the soldier thought little of it. Children were often fascinated by the stillness of the guards, their discipline, their uniforms, the mystery surrounding them. Normally, such curiosity passed quickly. But this time, the princess did not simply glance away. Instead, she lifted her hand. The movement was subtle, almost invisible. 2 fingers extended briefly, then lowered again. The entire gesture lasted less than a second, but the guard saw it clearly. And in that instant, his mind reacted with a speed that only years of training could create. Because what the princess had just done was not a random movement. It was a signal, a precise one, for a heartbeat. The soldier wondered whether his eyes had deceived him. Children often mimic gestures they saw without understanding them. Perhaps it had been coincidence. Perhaps the fingers had simply moved that way by accident. But deep within the discipline of his training, another realization formed. The gesture had been exact, not approximate, exact. And the signal it represented belonged to security protocol, so rare that most members of the royal household had never even heard of it. The signal meant one thing: immediate intervention required. Silently, without alarm, the soldier's heart tightened beneath the rigid collar of his tunic. Royal guards were trained to remain immovable unless commanded otherwise. Breaking position inside the palace corridors, especially during an official reception, was almost unthinkable. It violated the very order the guards existed to protect. Yet the signal he had just witnessed carried a different authority, a deeper authority, one that did not appear in ceremonial rulebooks. The soldier looked once more toward the princess. She had already lowered her hand. Her expression was calm, not frightened, not confused, simply calm. And in that calmness, the guard understood something else. She knew exactly what she had done. Before he could process the implications of that thought, movement appeared at the far end of the corridor. A small procession of senior royal figures approached through the archway, their conversation drifting softly through the hall as they moved between reception rooms. At the center of the group walked Queen Camilla. The queen consort moved with the composed confidence that had become familiar within royal ceremonies. Courtiers followed closely behind, discussing the evening's program as the group advanced toward the gallery corridor. Under normal circumstances, the guard would have remained perfectly still as the procession passed. That was the expectation. That was the rule. But the signal had already been given, and signals like that were never ignored. The soldier stepped forward. It was a single movement, measured, controlled, yet inside the silent corridor, it sounded like thunder, boot against marble. The sudden break in formation drew immediate attention from the surrounding staff. Several courtiers turned instinctively, their expressions tightening in confusion as the guard left his post. For a moment, no one spoke, because what they were witnessing simply did not happen. Royal guards did not abandon position during official events, certainly not without command. Yet the soldier continued forward, 2 steps, then 3, until he stood directly in the center of the corridor, directly in the path of the approaching royal procession. The effect was immediate. Queen Camilla slowed. Her advisors fell silent. The quiet conversations that filled the corridor moments earlier faded into uneasy stillness. The guard remained perfectly composed. His posture was identical to what had been moments earlier, disciplined, controlled, professional. But now he was no longer part of the background. He had become the center of attention. A senior aide stepped forward first, clearly uncertain how to interpret the interruption. "Soldier," the aide said carefully, "you appear to be obstructing the passage." The guard did not move. His voice, when he spoke, carried the steady restraint of someone following orders rather than creating a disturbance. "Apologies, sir," he said. "Temporary hold required." The words landed heavily in the air. Temporary hold? The phrase carried implications far beyond simple miscommunication. Inside Buckingham Palace, such language belonged to one place only: security protocol. Queen Camilla studied the guard with calm focus. Her expression did not show irritation, but there was unmistakable surprise. Breaking royal procession without explanation was no minor matter. "On whose authority?" she asked quietly. The soldier hesitated, not from fear, but from calculation. Certain explanations could not be given publicly, not in a corridor filled with guests. "Protective verification, ma'am," he replied. Behind him, Princess Charlotte stood silently near the window. Most of the courtiers had not yet noticed her. Their attention remained fixed on the soldier standing in the corridor, but the tension spreading through the hall was unmistakable. Whispers began to circulate quietly among the palace staff. Had there been a threat? Had security discovered something? No one had answers, and the guard offered none. He simply stood where he was, still, unmoving, waiting. Moments later, another figure appeared at the far end of the corridor, a senior palace security officer. Word traveled quickly inside Buckingham Palace, and any disruption involving the royal guard was treated with immediate seriousness. The officer approached with calm authority, scanning the corridor as he walked. He saw the halted procession. He saw the guard standing in the center of the hallway. Then his gaze moved beyond them and landed on the princess. Something changed in his expression. Subtle, but unmistakable. He stepped closer to the soldier. "Report," he said quietly. The guard leaned forward slightly, ensuring his words would not carry through the corridor. 3 words left his mouth. The officer's face went completely still, not with anger, not with disbelief, but with recognition, because the words a guard had spoken referred to a signal buried deep inside the palace's security system, one that had not been used in decades. The officer straightened slowly. He turned toward Queen Camilla with composed professionalism. "Apologies for the interruption, Your Majesty," he said. "A brief verification matter." His tone suggested finality, but the tension in the corridor remained. Camilla studied him carefully. Years inside royal circles had taught her to read the language of security personnel, the subtle signs that something serious was unfolding beneath calm words. But after a moment, she gave a small nod. The officer returned the gesture. The guard stepped aside. The corridor reopened. The procession resumed. Yet the moment had left its mark. Conversations inside the palace shifted subtly as the reception continued. Staff members exchanged quiet glances. Something unusual had occurred. Something unexplained. Meanwhile, far from the public rooms of the palace, the security officer began walking toward the inner offices of the Royal Protection Command. The report he would soon file contained a detail that would trouble everyone who read it, because the signal the guard had witnessed had not been misinterpreted. It had been executed perfectly, and that raised a question no one inside Buckingham Palace was prepared to answer. How could Princess Charlotte possibly know a signal that belonged only to the highest levels of palace security? As palace security quietly began reviewing the incident that night, they discovered something even more unsettling. The signal Princess Charlotte had used was part of a classified royal household emergency code, one that had been removed from modern training manuals years earlier. The corridor had long since returned to silence, yet the memory of the interruption still lingered like an unanswered question inside the walls of Buckingham Palace. To the guests attending the evening reception, the moment had already begun to dissolve into polite speculation, a minor delay, perhaps a routine security matter. Ceremonial life within the palace had a way of smoothing over disruptions, folding them quietly back into the rhythm of royal tradition. But behind the public rooms, where the true machinery of palace protection operated, the incident had already taken on a far more serious weight. Several floors below the state apartments, deep within the operational offices assigned to royal security, the atmosphere was markedly different from the elegance above. There were no chandeliers here, no polished marble floors, only quiet rooms filled with files, secure communication equipment, and officers whose duty was to anticipate dangers long before anyone else noticed them. Inside one of those rooms, a senior security officer placed a folder onto a long wooden table. The folder was thin, but the information inside it carried enormous implications. Around the table sat 3 members of the Palace Protection Command, experienced officers drawn from the Metropolitan Police Service and elite security units that safeguarded members of the royal household. Each of them had already read the initial report, yet none of them spoke immediately, because the subject of that report was difficult to accept. Finally, one of the officers leaned forward. "You're certain?" he asked. The officer who had witnessed the corridor incident nodded once. "I watched the guard describe the gesture himself," he said quietly. "It matched perfectly." Another officer turned a page in the report. 2 fingers raised briefly, lowered without hesitation. The gesture itself appeared harmless, but to those sitting in that room, it carried an entirely different meaning, because the movement belonged to something known only to a very small circle within royal protection. A silent code, one of the oldest systems of communication still preserved inside the palace's security doctrine. Most people assumed that royal protection relied primarily on visible security measures, guards, vehicles, surveillance teams. But in reality, the system protecting the monarchy was layered with traditions far older than modern technology. And among the oldest of those traditions were silent signals. Signals designed for moments when words could not be spoken. One of the officers reached toward a nearby cabinet and removed a heavy archival binder. The pages inside were yellowed with age, carefully preserved documentation from earlier decades of royal security planning. He turned several pages before stopping at a section marked with a discreet classification stamp. The heading read simply, "Royal Household Silent Emergency Signals." The room fell quiet again. The officer placed a binder on the table. Within its pages were diagrams of gestures, small hand movements, posture shifts, signals so subtle they could be mistaken for ordinary motion by anyone who did not know their meaning. Each one corresponded to a different security condition. Some indicated the presence of a threat. Others requested quiet escort. But one particular signal carried the highest priority. Immediate protective intervention. Discreet, without public alarm. The officer tapped the diagram gently. "This one," he said. The others leaned closer. 2 fingers raised. Lowered again. Exactly the movement described in the corridor report. The silence in the room deepened. One of the officers exhaled slowly. That code shouldn't exist anymore. He wasn't wrong. Years earlier, much of the palace's silent signal system had been quietly retired. Modern communication equipment had replaced many of the older protocols. Encrypted radios, hidden microphones, secure mobile systems. Technology had made many of the ancient gestures unnecessary. Yet certain signals have been preserved in restricted archives for one reason: royal children. Decades earlier, palace security planners had confronted a difficult reality. During public ceremonies or official receptions, young members of the royal family might occasionally find themselves in situations where speaking openly was impossible. Crowds, formal settings, moments where a raising alarm could create panic. To solve that problem, a small number of silent signals have been designed specifically for protection of royal heirs. Signals that could be performed subtly, even by a child. Signals that would summon immediate help from any trained guard nearby. But there was one critical rule. Those signals were never meant to be widely known. Only a handful of protection officers responsible for briefing royal families were permitted to teach them. And even then, such instruction happened only under very specific circumstances. One of the officers flipped through several more pages of the binder. The final training revision date appeared near the bottom of the page. 19 years earlier. Another officer frowned. That signal hasn't been in active training for over a decade. Exactly, the senior officer replied. Which means the princess couldn't have learned it through normal channels. The implication hung heavily in the air. Somewhere inside Buckingham Palace, knowledge that should have been restricted had reached a young princess. And the precision of the gesture made one thing painfully clear. It had not been guessed. It had been taught. One of the officers leaned back in his chair. Children don't execute signals like that accidentally. No, the senior officer agreed. They don't. He closed the binder slowly. For a moment, the room fell silent again as each officer considered the same question. Who had taught her? Inside the palace above them. The reception continued with careful elegance. Music drifted through the state apartments. Diplomats exchanged polite conversation beneath centuries-old portraits. Yet the quiet investigation unfolding beneath the palace was already beginning to ripple outward, because palace security operated on a simple principle. Every unexplained detail had a cause, and every cause could be traced. The officers began reviewing records from the past several weeks. Guest lists, staff assignments, movement logs within the palace corridors. Nothing immediately unusual appeared. But another report soon arrived, one that complicated the situation even further. The royal guard who had stepped into Queen Camilla's path had now submitted his formal written account of the event. The report was concise, disciplined, exactly what one would expect from a trained soldier. Yet one sentence near the end caught the attention of everyone in the room. The signal was executed with correct timing and clarity. One of the officers read the line aloud slowly. Correct timing. That detail mattered, because the silent signal system did not rely solely on hand position. Timing mattered just as much. The gesture had to be brief, deliberate, neither rushed nor exaggerated. A poorly executed movement might be mistaken for a casual motion, but a perfect one left no room for doubt. The guard's report suggested that Princess Charlotte had performed the signal exactly as it had been taught, which raised a deeper, more troubling possibility. If someone had shown her the signal, they had done so carefully, precisely, almost like a training demonstration. The senior officer rubbed his temples thoughtfully. How old is the princess now? 9. The room grew quiet again, because 9 years old was young. Young enough that most palace staff still viewed her primarily as a child. but old enough to observe, to remember, to learn. The officer reopened the binder. He studied the faded diagrams once more, then spoke quietly. "There's another problem." The others looked up. This particular signal wasn't just any request for assistance. He tapped the page again. This one was reserved for a very specific situation. "What situation?" The officer paused, then answered carefully. It allowed a royal child to request immediate protection if they felt unsafe during a formal event. The words settled over the table like a shadow. Unsafe during a formal event. No one spoke for several seconds, because the implication was impossible to ignore. If the princess had used the signal deliberately, then she had believed something was wrong. Above them, inside the polished halls of Buckingham Palace, the evening reception was finally drawing to a close. Guests began departing through the palace gates. Staff moved quietly through the corridors, restoring furniture, collecting glasses, resetting rooms for the following day. And somewhere among them, Princess Charlotte had already been escorted back toward the private family apartments. Most of the palace staff believed the evening had ended without incident. But deep inside the security offices, the investigation had only just begun, because the officers reviewing the files understood something that the guests did not. The signal used that evening belonged to a system designed for moments of danger, and the fact that a young princess had known it and used it perfectly meant that somewhere within the palace walls, a hidden piece of the story was waiting to be discovered. But just as the security officers began tracing how the princess could have learned such a restricted signal, another report arrived. The royal guard who had stopped the procession insisted on one final detail. Princess Charlotte's gesture had not been accidental. It had been executed exactly as written in the original Royal Protection Code. The report arrived just after midnight, when most of the lights inside Buckingham Palace had already dimmed and the great palace had settled into the quiet discipline of the night watch. Yet within the offices of royal protection, the evening's events were only beginning to reveal their deeper implications. The written statement from the royal guard who had stepped into the corridor had now been officially logged. It was concise, precise, and unmistakably professional. The kind of report written by someone who understood both the weight of his duty and the seriousness of the moment he had interrupted. But the final line of the document had changed the tone of the investigation entirely. Signal executed precisely according to restricted protective protocol. Not assumed, not misinterpreted. Executed precisely. The senior officer reading the report lowered the document slowly onto the table. Around him sat several members of the palace's protection command, each representing different branches of the security system responsible for safeguarding the royal household. The atmosphere in the room had grown heavier than it had been earlier that evening, because the situation now carried a second complication. The guard who had halted Queen Camilla's procession had formally declined to apologize for his actions. Inside the palace hierarchy, that decision carried enormous significance. The soldier had not shown disrespect. His tone during the event had remained disciplined, controlled, and entirely professional. But when asked privately whether he wished to offer a formal apology for the disruption, he had answered with a simple response. No apology required. Action taken under protective protocol. It was a statement of duty, and it quietly challenged the expectations of royal authority. The British monarchy operated within an intricate balance of tradition and hierarchy. Every member of staff inside the palace understood precisely where they stood within that structure. Guards followed orders. Courtiers managed protocol. Royal figures commanded the ceremonial structure of palace life. Yet the system protecting the monarchy had one unusual feature that often remained invisible to the public. In matters of immediate safety, royal protection officers answered not to rank, but to threat assessment. It was a principle carefully preserved within the operational guidelines of the Metropolitan Police Service. If a credible protective signal was triggered, the responding officer's obligation was absolute, even if that meant interrupting the movement of a senior royal figure, even if that meant disrupting ceremony, even if it meant challenging authority. The room fell quiet as the officers considered the implications. One of them finally spoke. "Has anyone spoken to Her Majesty directly?" The senior officer shook his head slightly. "Not yet. At the moment, the matter is being treated as a security verification issue," which was technically true, But the situation had already begun to ripple outward inside the palace. Word traveled quickly within royal households, even when staff attempted to contain it. Several courtiers who had witnessed the corridor interruption had already begun quietly discussing the incident among themselves. Why had the guard stepped forward? Why had the queen consort been stopped? And perhaps most troubling of all, why had the soldier refused to express regret afterward? Inside the private administrative offices of the palace, senior aides were now beginning to ask those same questions. One aide, who had been present during the corridor moment, recalled the silence that had followed the interruption. It had not been dramatic. There had been no raised voices, no public confrontation, but the stillness itself had carried weight, because the guard had not looked uncertain. He had looked certain. That certainty had unsettled several people who had witnessed the event. Early the following morning, the palace staff responsible for maintaining ceremonial order gathered for a quiet internal briefing. The goal was simple: clarify what had happened before speculation grew larger than the truth. A senior palace administrator opened the discussion carefully. The interruption last evening has been reviewed by Security Command, he began. At present, it is being treated as a procedural response to a protective signal. One of the aides frowned. A signal from whom? The administrator hesitated, because even inside the palace, that detail had not yet been widely shared. Finally, he answered, from Princess Charlotte. The reaction in the room was immediate. Not disbelief, but confusion. Several staff members exchanged glances. Princess Charlotte? Someone repeated. Yes. Another aide leaned forward. With respect, children don't issue security signals. Normally that would have been correct. But this situation was no longer normal. Meanwhile, the security investigation continued below the palace's public floors. Officers had begun reviewing surveillance recordings from the corridor where the signal had occurred. The footage showed the moment clearly. Princess Charlotte standing near the tall window, the guard across the corridor, and the brief, unmistakable movement of two raised fingers. The officers watched the clip several times. Each viewing confirmed the same conclusion. The gesture had not been playful. It had not been accidental. It had been deliberate. One officer paused the recording. Look at her posture, he said quietly. The others leaned closer. Charlotte's stance had been composed, her expression calm. She had glanced toward the guard only briefly before performing the signal. There had been no hesitation, no uncertainty. It looked remarkably similar to someone executing a practice instruction. Another officer spoke. Children imitate things they see. True, the senior officer replied, but they rarely imitate something this specific unless they've been shown exactly how to do it. The investigation began widening. Protection staff quietly interviewed several palace employees who had interacted with the princess over the previous month. Tutors, household staff, attendants responsible for escorting young members of the royal family during official events. None of them reported teaching her any form of security gesture. None of them had even heard of the signal. Yet another pattern soon began to emerge. Over the past several weeks, several guards stationed inside Buckingham Palace had noticed something curious. Princess Charlotte had occasionally paused near the security post during her walks through the palace corridors. At first, the guards assumed she was simply observing the uniforms, something many visitors did. But a few soldiers recalled that she had watched their movements with unusual attentiveness, not staring, studying, watching how they shifted their stance, how they communicated quietly with one another. One guard remembered a brief exchange from nearly 2 weeks earlier. The princess had passed his post while being escorted by a household attendant. Before continuing down the corridor, she had asked a simple question. Why do the guards move their hands sometimes? The soldier had answered politely. Signals, Your Royal Highness. She had nodded thoughtfully and then continued walking. At the time, the question had seemed innocent. Now, the memory felt different. Back in the security office, the senior officer leaned over the growing collection of notes and reports. What had begun as a brief corridor interruption was now revealing a pattern: observation, curiosity, attention to detail. The princess had been watching the guards, quietly, carefully, as though she had been trying to understand something. One of the investigators looked up Maybe she's simply curious about security. The senior officer considered that possibility. Perhaps. But curiosity alone did not explain perfect execution of a restricted signal. Another file was opened, this one containing the historical records of palace protection training manuals. Over the decades, these manuals had evolved repeatedly, adapting to new technologies and changing security realities. Yet certain older systems remain preserved inside the palace archives. The officer flipped slowly through the pages. Training diagrams, historical notes, instruction guidelines for protective officers assigned to royal children. Then he stopped. A particular page caught his attention. He leaned closer. "This shouldn't be here," he murmured. Another officer approached the table. "What is it?" The senior officer pointed to a faded annotation printed near the bottom of the page. "Archive signal, removed from modern training revisions." The date beside the note showed that the signal Princess Charlotte had used had been officially retired years earlier. Removed from active instruction. No longer included in the manuals used to train modern protection officers, which meant something extraordinary. The signal Charlotte had performed did not appear in any current training system. No modern guard would have learned it through standard instruction, and no palace staff member responsible for royal education should have encountered it either. Yet the princess had used it flawlessly. One officer leaned back slowly. "That's impossible." The senior officer closed the file. "Not impossible." He paused, just unexplained. Outside the security offices, dawn was beginning to rise over London. The early morning light touched the stone facade of Buckingham Palace, illuminating the familiar symbol of the monarchy for thousands of people passing through the city streets. To the public, the palace remained a place of ceremony and tradition, but inside its quieter corridors, a question had now taken hold. A young princess had demonstrated knowledge of a signal that no longer existed in the modern security system, and no one yet understood how. As investigators continued reviewing the palace archives, one final discovery deep within the historical protection records sent a quiet chill through the room. The signal Princess Charlotte had used had not simply been removed from modern manuals. It had been deliberately erased from them. By the following evening, the corridors of Buckingham Palace had returned to their familiar rhythm. Visitors moved through the palace gates. Staff carried out their routines with the quiet discipline that had defined royal households for centuries. To anyone observing from the outside, nothing seemed unusual. Yet beneath that calm surface, a far quieter investigation had begun to unfold. Inside the palace archives, a place rarely seen even by senior members of the household, the security officers continued tracing the origins of the signal Princess Charlotte had used. The archives were located in one of the oldest sections of the palace structure. Narrow corridors lined with secured cabinets stretched deep beneath the main residence, containing documents that recorded decades of royal administration and protection planning. Some files were recent, others dated back generations. Within those cabinets rested the operational history of how the monarchy had learned to protect itself in a changing world. That afternoon, a palace archivist carefully unlocked a long-sealed storage drawer containing protection manuals from earlier eras of royal security planning. The documents inside were older than most of the officers reviewing them. Their pages carried the faint scent of aging paper, the quiet reminder that the monarchy's protective systems had evolved slowly, shaped by both experience and caution. The archivist placed several folders onto the table. "These are the original files from a protective briefing program," she explained quietly. The senior security officer looked up. "Briefing program?" She nodded. "Designed for royal heirs." The room fell silent as the officers began examining the contents. Decades earlier, royal protection planners had faced a unique challenge. Children born into the royal family lived much of their lives surrounded by ceremony, crowds, and public attention. Unlike ordinary children, they could not simply leave dangerous situations on their own. If a moment of discomfort or danger ever arose during a formal event, they needed a way to alert protection officers without creating panic. So the planners had created a solution, a discreet instructional program. During certain private briefings, young members of the royal family were quietly shown a small number of emergency signals, simple gestures that could summon help from nearby guards. The instruction was never dramatic, never presented as something frightening. Instead, it was explained as a safety measure, a quiet reassurance that protection was always nearby. One of the officers flipped through the training notes. The signals were intentionally simple, small movements that could easily be mistaken for ordinary gestures by anyone who did not understand their meaning. A hand adjusting a sleeve, a brief glance toward a guard, or, in the case of the signal now under investigation, 2 fingers raised momentarily before being lowered again. Each signal carried a specific instruction: escort requested, private conversation required, or in the most serious case, immediate protective intervention. The officer looked up from file. This program, when was it last used? The archivist consulted a record sheet. The final documented briefing occurred nearly 20 years ago. Another officer frowned. That long? Yes. She turned another page. The program was eventually discontinued. Modern communication systems replaced most of the need for silent signals. Radios, security earpieces, encrypted communication channels. Technology had allowed protection teams to communicate instantly without relying on visual signals. Yet one detail inside the file caught the senior officer's attention. The silent signals had not been discontinued because they were ineffective. They had been discontinued because they were considered unnecessary. But unnecessary did not mean forgotten. He continued reading. Near the back of the file, several handwritten notes appeared. Records written by a former Royal Protection officer responsible for conducting those early briefings. The handwriting was careful and deliberate. Each entry described the purpose of the instruction sessions. Demonstration of emergency signals to royal heirs conducted privately during routine protection orientation. The officer leaned closer. Another line stood out. Children respond best when signals are presented as calm, simple instructions rather than warnings. The archivist spoke again. These sessions were designed to be reassuring, not alarming. The officers nodded. That approach made sense. Royal children already grew up under intense public scrutiny. There was no need to burden them with unnecessary fear. But the more they read, the clearer something became. The signal Princess Charlotte had used had once been part of those briefings, which meant that decades ago, at least some royal heirs had been taught exactly how to perform it. One of the investigators leaned back slowly. So she didn't invent the signal. No, the senior officer replied. She learned it. The question that followed was unavoidable. From whom? The protection briefing program had ended years before Princess Charlotte was born. Most of the officers who had conducted those sessions had long since retired. Some had even passed away. Yet the instructions they once delivered were still preserved in these files, carefully recorded, quietly archived. The archivist turned another page. "This is interesting," she said softly. The officers looked up. At the bottom of the document was a small notation referencing a private diary maintained by one of the senior protection officers who had overseen the briefing program. The diary had never been part of the official training records, but its existence had been logged in the archive inventory. "Do we still have it?" the senior officer asked. The archivist nodded. She walked toward a nearby cabinet and unlocked a smaller compartment. Inside rested a leather-bound notebook, its cover worn slightly with age. She placed it gently on the table. For a moment, no one touched it, because personal records often reveal details that official reports left unsaid. Finally, the senior officer opened the notebook. The pages inside were filled with neat, methodical handwriting, observations, reflections, notes about the unique challenge of protecting royal children. Several entries described the early training sessions. Today, demonstrated silent signal protocol. The 2 young members of the family both responded quickly. Children learn faster than adults expect. Another entry read, "Important to ensure signals remain simple. The goal is not to frighten them, but to give them confidence that help is always within reach." The officer continued reading. Then one final entry near the back of the diary caused him to pause. He read it silently first, then aloud. Signals may disappear from official manuals in time, but the knowledge must occasionally be passed quietly between generations of protection staff. The room grew very still. The sentence suggested something subtle but powerful. Even when formal training programs ended, certain knowledge within the palace security system might continue to exist informally, pass along through quiet conversations, private reminders, unwritten traditions among the officers responsible for safeguarding the monarchy. The officer closed the diary slowly. For the first time since the investigation had begun, a new possibility emerged. Perhaps Princess Charlotte had not discovered the signal through a written manual. Perhaps someone had simply shown it to her, quietly, without realizing how seriously she might remember it. Above them, the palace continued its routine. Staff moved through the hallways preparing for the next day's events. Guards rotated through their evening posts. And somewhere within the private apartments, Princess Charlotte had likely already returned to her ordinary childhood routine. Yet the investigation now carried a different emotional weight, because the officers reviewing the files were beginning to see the moment in the corridor from another perspective. When the princess raised her fingers, she had not appeared frightened. She had appeared calm, certain, as though she understood exactly what the signal meant, and exactly what response it would trigger. One of the officers finally spoke. If someone did teach her, they probably believed it was harmless. The senior officer nodded. Perhaps. But another possibility remained. The princess might not only have learned the signal, she might have remembered it for a reason. The officers gathered the files and prepared their next report for palace leadership. The official explanation of the corridor incident would likely remain confidential. Events involving royal security rarely appeared in public records. Yet everyone involved understood something quietly significant. The small gesture that had stopped a royal procession had not been accidental. It had been rooted in a piece of palace history nearly forgotten by modern systems. A forgotten safeguard. A silent language once designed to protect royal children. And somehow, that language had reached Princess Charlotte. As the files were returned to the palace archives, one final detail from the diary lingered in the minds of the investigators. Decades earlier, the protection officer had written a final note beside the signal diagram. Children rarely forget what they are shown when they understand it protects them. By the time the next morning's light settled over the stone facade of Buckingham Palace, the palace had already begun its quiet return to order. Within the monarchy, disruption was rarely allowed to linger in public view. Centuries of tradition had shaped a system where even the most unusual moments were absorbed back into the steady rhythm of royal life. Ceremonies continued. Meetings proceeded. Guests arrived and departed through the familiar palace gates. To anyone standing outside the palace walls, nothing appeared different. But inside the administrative offices where the monarchy's internal matters were quietly reviewed, the investigation into the corridor incident was reaching its final stage. The security officers had now completed their reconstruction of events. Every report had been reviewed, every witness statement examined, the surveillance footage studied frame by frame, and the conclusion was both simple and complicated at the same time. The royal guard who had stepped into Queen Camilla's path had acted correctly. The determination had not been made lightly. Within the palace hierarchy, interrupting the movement of a senior royal figure was not a small matter. Protocol within royal residences was built on precision, every movement choreographed, every step anticipated by staff who ensured that ceremony flowed without interruption. Yet security doctrine followed a different set of rules. Protection officers did not operate within the ceremonial hierarchy. Their loyalty was directed towards safety. And when a recognized protective signal was issued, the chain of response became absolute. The officer reviewing the case summarized the conclusion carefully during a private briefing. The guard responded exactly as his training required. He explained. The signal he observed corresponded to a request for immediate protective intervention. In that moment, his obligation was to act. A senior palace official sitting across the table considered the statement. Even if that meant halting a royal procession, the officer answered without hesitation. Yes, because the system protecting the monarchy had been built on one guiding principle. The safety of the royal family, particularly the younger generation, always took precedence over ceremony. That principle had been quietly reaffirmed many times throughout the monarchy's long history. Protection officers were trained to respect royal authority, but they were also trained to recognize moments when duty required decisive action. The guard who had stepped forward in the corridor had not acted impulsively. He had acted according to the highest obligation of his position. Inside the palace, that distinction mattered, and it was now understood that no disciplinary action would follow. The matter would remain confidential, handled entirely within the palace's internal review process. Yet the decision carried deeper meaning than a simple procedural conclusion, because the moment in the corridor had quietly demonstrated something about the structure of royal protection that few people ever witnessed. Ceremony may have defined the public face of the monarchy, but duty defined the unseen systems protecting it. Later that afternoon, the royal guard involved in the incident was summoned for a final administrative conversation. The meeting took place in a small office within the palace's security wing, far from the ornate halls where visitors admired royal history. The guard entered the room with the same disciplined composure he had maintained since the event occurred. Years of service had trained him to remain steady regardless of circumstance. The senior officer reviewing the case spoke first. "You understand the situation we've been examining?" "Yes, sir." "Your report has been reviewed carefully." The guard nodded. "I stand by it." The room fell silent, because the statement was undeniably true. Princess Charlotte had not only recognized the signal, she had executed it with composure, without hesitation, without drawing unnecessary attention. The kind of calm awareness usually associated with experienced protection officers. One of the investigators finally said what several of them had been thinking. Perhaps the responsibility of her position teaches those instincts earlier than we realize. The senior officer closed the final report folder. Perhaps, but he added something else. Or perhaps the quiet systems protecting this family are stronger than we think. Outside the palace windows, London's evening lights had begun glowing across the city skyline. The great residence of the monarchy stood peacefully against the night sky, its centuries of history resting silently within its walls. Inside those walls, the incident would soon fade from official discussion. No public announcement would ever describe what happened in that corridor. No official record would recount the moment when ceremony paused for the sake of duty. Yet for those who had witnessed it, the memory would remain clear. A small gesture, 2 raised fingers, a guard stepping forward, and a quiet reminder that the true strength of the monarchy did not rest solely in tradition or titles. It rested in the unwavering commitment of those sworn to protect it. The palace would never record the moment in its official history. But among the guards who stood watch over the crown, the meaning of that evening would endure. A reminder that sometimes the smallest signal can reveal the deepest bonds of duty. Inside the private meeting room at Buckingham Palace, the atmosphere had shifted into something heavier than ordinary royal tension. The silence carried weight. Every person seated at the table understood that the situation unfolding was no longer a matter of simple misunderstanding. Royal protocol had been triggered by a signal that should never have appeared in a public reception hall. And the question still hung in the air like an unspoken warning. How had Princess Charlotte learned it? Across the table, Prince William remained composed, but his attention never drifted from his daughter. He was not angry, not yet, but there was a seriousness in his posture that everyone in the room recognized. Because for William, this was no longer about etiquette. It was about protection. The captain of the Royal Guard explained again, carefully and without speculation. The gesture Charlotte had used was part of an internal emergency signal system. It existed only for situations where a royal family member needed immediate assistance but could not speak openly. The system was rarely discussed, rarely practiced, and certainly never taught to children. William listened without interruption. But what concerned him most was not the signal itself. It was the expression he had seen on Charlotte's face when she used it. There had been no confusion, no hesitation. She had known exactly what she was doing. Across the room, Princess Anne finally spoke, her voice calm but firm. "There are only 2 possibilities," she said. "Either she learned it by accident, which is nearly impossible, or someone showed her." The room fell silent again, because if the second possibility was true, it meant something far more serious than a misunderstanding had taken place inside Buckingham Palace. William slowly turned toward Charlotte. His voice, when he finally spoke, was gentle but direct. "Charlotte," he asked quietly, "who taught you that signal?" The young princess looked at her father. For a moment, it seemed like she might hesitate, but then she answered with the simple honesty only a child could give, and the name she spoke changed the entire tone of the room, because the person she mentioned was someone no one in that meeting had expected to hear. The officer studied him for a moment. You remain confident that the signal you observed was deliberate? Yes, sir. Why? The guard answered calmly. The timing was correct. The motion was brief and precise. He paused, and the princess made direct eye contact before performing the gesture. The officer leaned back slightly. In your judgment, she understood what the signal meant. Yes, sir. The simplicity of the answer carried quiet weight, because the investigation had already reached a similar conclusion. The officer closed a file on the desk. Your actions are considered consistent with protective protocol. The guard acknowledged the statement with respectful nod, but the officer added one more thought. Moments like this are rare. You may not encounter another one during your entire career. The guard replied simply, Our duty is to be ready if we do. The meeting ended shortly afterward. The official record would note only that the event had been reviewed and resolved. But among the officers responsible for protecting the royal household, the moment would not be forgotten easily, because it had revealed something unusual. A child had issued a protective signal, and a guard had responded without hesitation. Meanwhile, within the private family quarters of Buckingham Palace, the atmosphere was far removed from the quiet formality of the security offices. Princess Charlotte's life continued according to the carefully structured routine designed for royal children. Lessons with tutors, afternoon walks within the palace gardens, moments of play away from public attention. To most people observing from the outside, she remained simply a young member of the royal family, growing up within extraordinary surroundings. Yet those who had witnessed the corridor incident could not help noticing something subtle in her demeanor afterward. She appeared composed, not distressed, not confused, as though the moment had carried meaning she fully understood. One palace attendant who had been present during the reception later described the impression quietly to a colleague. It wasn't panic, she said. She looked certain. That observation circulated quietly among the staff who had been near the corridor that evening, and gradually another realization began to form. Princess Charlotte had not used the signal out of fear. She had used it because she knew it would work, because she trusted the system designed to protect her. Later that evening, as the palace lights began dimming once again, several senior members of the Protection Command gathered for one final discussion before closing the investigation. The senior officer summarized the matter carefully. The signal was authentic. The response was appropriate. No further action is required. One of the officers nodded. Then the case is closed. Yes. But another officer spoke quietly from the end of the table. There's still one remarkable part of this story. The others looked toward him. A 9-year-old understood a security protocol most adults inside this building have never even heard of.